The bustling Coffee Bean Cafe in downtown Singapore was unusually quiet that morning when Sarah Chen first laid eyes on Marcus Zhang. It was a chance encounter that would change both their lives forever, though neither of them knew it at the time. Sarah, dressed in her usual designer outfit, had stopped for her morning coffee before heading to her father's real estate company where she worked as a marketing director. Marcus sat in the corner, wearing a simple white shirt and black pants, deeply focused on his laptop screen. When Sarah's coffee order was mixed up with his, their eyes met for the first time. There was something different about him, a quiet confidence that caught Sarah's attention immediately. "I think this is yours," Marcus said with a gentle smile, holding out her vanilla latte. His simple gesture and warm demeanor made Sarah's heart skip a beat. That chance meeting turned into daily coffee encounters, then lunch dates, and finally dinner. Sarah found herself drawn to Marcus's kind heart and humble nature. He worked as a regular office employee at a small tech company, making enough to live comfortably, but nothing compared to her family's wealth. But Sarah didn't care about money. She had found someone who saw her for who she was, not as Richard Chen's daughter. 6 months into their relationship, Marcus proposed to Sarah on a regular Tuesday evening. There were no fancy restaurants or elaborate setups. Instead, he asked her to marry him during their usual evening walk in the neighborhood park, with a simple but elegant ring that he had saved up for months to buy. Sarah said yes without hesitation, tears of joy streaming down her face. The real challenge began when Sarah decided to tell her father about the engagement. Richard Chen was not just any businessman. He was one of Singapore's most prominent real estate developers. The Chen family name carried weight in social circles, and Richard had always imagined his daughter marrying someone from their elite social class. On a Sunday afternoon, during their weekly family dinner at the Chen mansion, Sarah gathered her courage. The family's personal chef had prepared an elaborate spread of Chinese and Western dishes, just as her father liked it. The crystal chandelier above the massive dining table sparkled, and classical music played softly in the background. "Father, I have something to tell you," Sarah said, her voice slightly trembling but determined. Her mother, Linda, looked up from her soup, sensing the seriousness in her daughter's tone. "I'm engaged to be married," Sarah continued, unconsciously touching the ring on her finger. Richard Chen put down his fork, his face showing mild interest. "Oh, to whose son? The Tangs? Or perhaps the Lims?" "His name is Marcus Zhang," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "He works as a software developer at TechStart Solutions." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's expression darkened as he processed the information. A software developer? At some unknown company? This was not what he had envisioned for his only daughter. "You can't be serious," Richard finally spoke, his voice cold. "A regular office worker. Do you know what people will say? What about your future? Our family's reputation?" Sarah's mother tried to intervene, but Richard raised his hand to silence her. "How long have you known this Marcus?" 8 months, father. And I love him. He's kind, hardworking, and honest." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Love? You're being naive, Sarah. Men like him only see our family's wealth. How convenient that he proposed to you, the daughter of Richard Chen." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had expected this reaction, but it still hurt to hear her father dismiss Marcus so easily. "You will end this engagement," Richard declared, standing up from his chair. "I won't allow my daughter to throw away her future for some fortune hunter." But Sarah stood her ground. For the first time in her life, she defied her father directly. "No, father, I'm marrying Marcus, with or without your blessing." As Sarah left the dining room that evening, Richard Chen was already formulating plans in his mind. He would not let this nobody take advantage of his daughter. Little did he know that his attempts to investigate and humiliate Marcus would lead to revelations that would shake the very foundations of his assumptions about wealth, status, and what truly matters in life. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become the talk of Singapore's elite social circles for years to come. The weeks following Sarah's engagement announcement turned the peaceful Chen household into a battlefield of silent tensions and calculated moves. Richard Chen, never one to accept defeat easily, began his campaign to break up the engagement in subtle but powerful ways. One sunny morning, Sarah arrived at her office in the Chen Tower to find her entire department buzzing with excitement. Her father had just announced a new position, marketing director for their upcoming international expansion. It was Sarah's dream role, with one catch. It required immediate relocation to London for at least 3 years. "It's a perfect opportunity for you," Richard told his daughter later that day in his top-floor office, overlooking the Singapore skyline. "You've always wanted to work internationally." His voice was smooth, caring, but Sarah could see right through his plan. "And what about my engagement, father?" Sarah asked, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Richard shrugged, pretending to review some documents on his desk. "Well, if Marcus truly loves you, he'll wait. Unless, of course, he's in a hurry to get his hands on our family's assets." Meanwhile, Marcus faced his own set of challenges. Mysterious rumors began circulating at his workplace about his relationship with Sarah. Some colleagues suddenly became distant, while others tried to get closer, hoping to benefit from his connection to the Chen family. His boss started assigning him impossible deadlines, making his work life increasingly difficult. One evening, as Marcus was working late to meet another unrealistic deadline, he received an unexpected visitor. Richard Chen walked into his small office, looking completely out of place in his perfectly tailored suit. "Good evening, Marcus," Richard said, not waiting for an invitation to sit down. "I'll be direct. How much?" Marcus looked up from his computer, confused. "Excuse me. How much will it take for you to leave my daughter alone?" Richard pulled out his checkbook. "Name your price. Everyone has one." Marcus sat back in his chair, a calm expression on his face. "Mr. Chen, I understand your concern for Sarah, but you're wrong about me. I love your daughter for who she is, not for your family's wealth." Richard's face hardened. "Love doesn't pay bills, young man. What can you offer my daughter? This tiny office? A life of budgeting and compromise. Sarah is used to the best of everything." "I can offer her happiness and respect," Marcus replied quietly, "something she doesn't always get at home." Richard's eyes flashed with anger. He stood up, putting his checkbook away. "You'll regret this decision. Nobody refuses Richard Chen." The next day, Marcus was called into his boss's office. His company had suddenly decided to downsize, and his position was being eliminated. When he tried applying for other jobs, he found doors mysteriously closed. Richard Chen's influence in Singapore's business world ran deep. Sarah was furious when she learned about her father's interference. She stormed into his office, demanding an explanation. "You're ruining his life," she shouted, tears in her eyes. "Why can't you see that he's different?" "I'm protecting you," Richard insisted. "You're too naive to see it, but I know his type. Once he gets what he wants, he'll leave you with nothing." That evening, Sarah made a decision. She packed her bags and moved out of the family mansion, using her savings to rent a small apartment. She chose love over luxury, much to her father's dismay. Marcus never complained about losing his job. Instead, he spent his days working on freelance projects, while quietly making wedding preparations with Sarah. They chose a simple venue, the Grand Plaza Hotel, not knowing it would become the stage for an unexpected revelation. As the wedding date approached, Richard Chen grew more desperate. His private investigators had found nothing suspicious about Marcus, which only made Richard more paranoid. What was this young man hiding? Why couldn't they find any dirt on him? Little did Richard know, his greatest humiliation was yet to come. The simple wedding venue he looked down upon would soon become the setting for a truth that would shake Singapore's entire social hierarchy and force him to question everything he believed about wealth, status, and true worth. Richard Chen sat in his dimly lit home office, staring at the files spread across his mahogany desk. The clock showed 2 a.m., but sleep was the last thing on his mind. For the past month, he had hired Singapore's top 3 private investigation agencies to dig into Marcus Zhang's background, and their findings, or lack thereof, were driving him crazy. "Sir, there's something strange about this man," said Tommy Lee, his most trusted investigator, during their meeting earlier that day. "It's like he exists, but doesn't exist at the same time." The basic facts were there. Marcus Zhang, age 28, graduated from a regular university in Singapore. He had worked at several small tech companies, lived in a modest apartment, and had no criminal record. But beyond these surface details, things got mysteriously vague. No childhood photos, no school records before university, no family background. Even his bank accounts showed only normal salary deposits and regular living expenses. It was too clean, too perfect, like a carefully crafted cover story. Richard picked up his phone and dialed a number he rarely used. After 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. "Mr. Chen, it's unusual for you to call at this hour." "Inspector Wang, I need a favor," Richard said, rubbing his temples. "Remember that land deal I helped you with last year? I need you to look into someone for me." The next morning, Sarah visited her mother, Linda, who was having breakfast in the garden. Their family mansion felt different now that Sarah had moved out, quieter, colder somehow. "Mom, has father always been this controlling?" Sarah asked, stirring her untouched tea. Linda sighed, putting down her cup. "Your father. He built everything from nothing, Sarah. His own father abandoned the family when he was 12. He had to drop out of school to support your grandmother by selling newspapers on the street." Sarah looked up, surprised. She had never heard this story before. "That's why he's so protective of our family's wealth," Linda continued. "He worked too hard for it to let someone take advantage of us." Meanwhile, across the city, Marcus was meeting with the wedding planner at the Grand Plaza Hotel. As they discussed arrangements in the hotel's coffee shop, a group of suited men at the next table kept glancing in his direction. Marcus pretended not to notice when one of them made a phone call and whispered urgently into the phone. He simply smiled and continued discussing flower arrangements for the ceremony. That afternoon, Inspector Wang called Richard with unexpected news. "Mr. Chen, I ran every possible check on this Marcus Zhang," the inspector said, his voice unusually serious. "Here's the strange part. Someone blocked my access. Not just regular encryption, but high-level government clearance blocks." Richard sat up straighter in his chair. "What do you mean, government blocks?" "The kind of security usually reserved for." Inspector Wang lowered his voice. "Very important people or families. Mr. Chen, whoever this Marcus Zhang is, he's not just some ordinary office worker." This information sent Richard into a frenzy of new investigations. He called in favors from business partners in Hong Kong, Taiwan, and mainland China. He hired international private investigators. He even tried reaching out to his connections in Singapore's elite social circles. But each attempt to uncover Marcus's true identity hit a wall. Some people refused to help, saying they couldn't risk getting involved. Others simply didn't return his calls. A few even seemed frightened when he mentioned Marcus's name. One evening, Richard received an anonymous email. "Stop investigating Marcus Zhang. Some doors are better left unopened." The warning only made Richard more determined. As he dug deeper, he began noticing strange things. Luxury cars following his daughter and Marcus from a distance. Men in suits appearing whenever the couple went out, with someone protecting them or monitoring them. The wedding was now just days away, and Richard felt like he was running out of time. He had to find out the truth about Marcus before Sarah made what could be the biggest mistake of her life. But with each passing day, the mystery only grew deeper. Little did Richard know, his obsessive investigation was about to lead to a revelation that would make him the talk of Singapore's high society, for all the wrong reasons. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather at the Grand Plaza Hotel. The morning sun sparkled off the hotel's glass exterior as luxury cars pulled up one after another, dropping off Singapore's elite. Despite Sarah's wishes for a simple ceremony, Richard Chen had invited over 300 guests, mostly business associates and social connections. Sarah stood in the bridal suite, wearing an elegant white gown that she had chosen herself, not the designer dress her father had tried to force on her. Her mother, Linda, helped adjust her veil while fighting back tears. "You look beautiful," Linda whispered, hugging her daughter. "Just remember, no matter what happens today, follow your heart." Meanwhile, in another part of the hotel, Richard Chen was having a private meeting with the hotel's security team. He had paid them extra to be on high alert, though he wasn't exactly sure what he was expecting to find. "Sir," one of his assistants interrupted, looking nervous. "There's something strange happening in the lobby." Richard rushed down to find an unusual scene. Several luxury cars with diplomatic plates had arrived, and men in dark suits were conducting security sweeps of the hotel. When Richard tried to question the hotel manager about these unexpected guests, the manager simply bowed and said, "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm not at liberty to discuss our other guests." In the groom's room, Marcus was calmly adjusting his tie when his phone buzzed. He read the message, smiled slightly, and deleted it immediately. Outside his door, two men in suits stood guard, though nobody had asked them to be there. As guests filled the hotel's grand ballroom, whispers circulated among the crowd. Some of Singapore's most powerful business figures had unexpectedly shown up, despite not being on the guest list. Even more surprising, they weren't gathering around Richard Chen as usual. Instead, they kept glancing toward the entrance, as if waiting for someone important to arrive. Richard noticed all of this with growing unease. Something was very wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on what. Just then, he saw a familiar face in the crowd, his old friend Thomas Wong, CEO of Asia's largest banking group. "Thomas," Richard called out, "I didn't know you were invited." Thomas looked uncomfortable. "I received a special invitation," he said carefully. "Richard, there's something you should know." But before he could finish, the wedding music began. The guests took their seats, and Sarah started her walk down the aisle. She was radiant, her face glowing with happiness as she looked at Marcus waiting at the altar. Richard felt his chest tighten. This was his last chance to stop what he increasingly felt was a huge mistake. As the ceremony proceeded, his mind raced through all the mysterious signs, locked investigations, the diplomatic cars, the unexpected high-profile guests, the security teams. Just as the priest asked if anyone had any reason why this couple should not be married, Richard stood up. The room fell silent. "I object," he said loudly, his voice echoing through the ballroom. "Before this goes any further, I demand to know the truth about who you really are, Marcus John." Gasps filled the room. Sarah turned to her father, her face a mixture of anger and embarrassment. "Father, how dared you?" But Marcus raised his hand gently, signaling Sarah to wait. For the first time since Richard had known him, Marcus's humble demeanor shifted slightly. He stood straighter, and something in his eyes changed, a quiet authority that Richard had never noticed before. "Mr. Chen," Marcus said calmly, taking out his phone. "You wanted the truth about who I am. Very well." He dialed a number and spoke a few words in Mandarin. Suddenly, the energy in the room changed dramatically. The suited men throughout the ballroom stood at attention. Several of Singapore's most powerful business leaders rose from their seats, bowing slightly toward Marcus. Richard felt the blood drain from his face as he finally began to understand just how badly he had misjudged his future son-in-law. The Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom had fallen into complete silence. All eyes were fixed on Marcus John, who now stood with an air of quiet authority that seemed to transform him entirely. Even Sarah, who had known him for months, noticed something different about her fiancé's posture and expression. A tall, elderly man in an expensive suit approached Marcus and bowed deeply. Richard Chen recognized him immediately. It was Mr. Wu, the owner of Asia's largest hotel chain, or at least that's what everyone had thought until now. "Young Master Zhang," Mr. Wu said respectfully in Mandarin, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We've kept your secret as requested, but perhaps it's time the Chen family knew who they're really dealing with." Marcus nodded and turned to face Richard Chen. "Mr. Chen, you've spent months trying to prove I'm not good enough for your daughter. You've investigated my background, tried to bribe me, and even ruined my job. All because you thought I was after your family's wealth." He gestured around the grand ballroom. "This hotel where we're standing? It's one of 200 properties owned by the Zhang International Group, the same group that owns 37 technology companies across Asia, 15 banks, and the largest private investment firm in Singapore." Richard's face turned pale as the revelation hit him. The Zhang International Group was one of Asia's largest conglomerates, worth billions. Its mysterious owner was known for avoiding publicity, operating through layers of trustees and managers. "My father built this empire," Marcus continued, his voice steady. "But 3 years ago, he decided to step back and handed control to me. I wanted to experience life away from all this wealth and power. I wanted to find someone who would love me for who I am, not what I own." Sarah stood frozen, her wedding dress shimmering in the ballroom lights. "Marcus, why didn't you tell me?" Marcus turned to her, his eyes softening. "Because the moment I met you at that coffee shop, I saw someone special. Someone who treated me like a normal person, who laughed at my bad jokes, who cared about my dreams. Not my bank account or my family name." The whispers among the guests grew louder. Many of Singapore's elite were now looking at Richard Chen with a mixture of pity and amusement. The man who had spent months looking down on his daughter's poor fiancé had unknowingly been insulting one of Asia's wealthiest young businessmen. Thomas Wong, the banking CEO, stepped forward. Richard, the Zhang family's net worth is approximately 50 times that of your entire company. They own shares in most major Asian corporations, including a significant portion of your real estate group. Richard Chen felt his legs grow weak. He had to grab a nearby chair for support. All those months of investigations, the threats, the attempts to bribe Marcus, it had all been a horrible mistake. He hadn't been protecting his daughter from a fortune hunter. He had been insulting one of the most powerful families in Asia. I don't understand, Richard stammered. Why did you take a job as a regular office worker? Why live in a small apartment? Because true character shows when nobody knows who you really are, Marcus replied. I wanted to prove to myself that I could succeed on my own merits. And more importantly, I wanted to find genuine love. He walked over to Sarah and took her hands in his. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I understand if this changes things between us. Sarah looked into his eyes, tears rolling down her cheeks. But then, to everyone's surprise, she started laughing. You mean to tell me that all those times I insisted on paying for our coffee dates? Marcus grinned. Those were some of my favorite moments. You were trying to protect my small salary, even though you came from a wealthy family yourself. That's when I knew you were special. The tension in the room broke as several guests chuckled. Even some of the stern-faced security personnel cracked smiles. But Richard Chen remained frozen in his spot, his world turned upside down, as he realized just how badly he had misjudged the situation. The next hour at the Grand Plaza Hotel was unlike anything Singapore's high society had ever seen. As the initial shock of Marcus's revelation settled, the wedding guests began to understand the full scope of what they had just witnessed. The ballroom buzzed with excited conversations and hurried phone calls as everyone tried to process the dramatic turn of events. Richard Chen sat alone in a corner of the ballroom, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. Various business associates approached him, some offering sympathy, others barely hiding their amusement at his situation. Each interaction felt like a small stab to his pride. Mr. Chen, a soft voice called. He looked up to see Marcus's assistant, Jenny, standing before him. Mr. Zhang would like to speak with you privately in the hotel's executive suite. Richard followed Jenny to the top floor, his mind racing. Just that morning, he had thought himself superior to Marcus. Now, he was being summoned like a junior employee. The elevator ride felt endless. In the luxurious suite, he found Marcus and Sarah sitting together on a plush sofa. Marcus had removed his tie and jacket, looking more like the simple office worker Richard had first met. But now, Richard could see the subtle signs of power he had missed before, the perfect posture, the quiet confidence, the way even the hotel staff seemed to hold their breath when he spoke. Please, sit down, Mr. Chen. Marcus gestured to a chair. I believe we need to have an honest conversation. Sarah squeezed Marcus's hand and stood up. I'll give you two some privacy, she said, leaving the room. Once they were alone, Marcus leaned forward. I want to tell you the full story, Mr. Chen. You deserve to know why I chose to live the way I did. He pulled out his phone and showed Richard a series of news articles from 3 years ago. They were about various wealthy heirs from Asian families, scandals, failed marriages, drug problems, and bankruptcies. When my father handed over the company to me, Marcus explained, he gave me one piece of advice. He said, money shows you who people pretend to be, but struggle shows you who they really are. Marcus continued, his voice thoughtful. I saw too many of my wealthy friends rush into marriages that ended in disaster. Everyone wanted their money, not their love, so I made a decision. He showed Richard more photos. Marcus moving into his small apartment, starting his entry-level job, riding the public bus. I created a new identity, not completely fake, but simplified. I worked hard, lived simply, and waited to see who would value me as a person, not as a bank account. Richard listened, his shame growing with each word. He remembered all the times he had looked down on Marcus, all the cruel comments about his simple lifestyle. Then I met Sarah. Marcus smiled. She was different. Despite coming from wealth, she never acted entitled. She offered to split bills, chose simple dates over fancy restaurants, and defended me when people looked down on my job. But why continue the deception for so long? Richard finally spoke. Why let me treat you so badly? Marcus's expression turned serious, because I needed to be sure, not just about Sarah, but about the family I was marrying into. Your actions, Mr. Chen, showed me exactly what I needed to know about your character. Richard felt the weight of those words crush him. In trying to protect his daughter from a supposedly poor man, he had revealed the worst parts of himself. However, Marcus continued, surprising Richard, your daughter's reaction to my true identity today proves something else. The way you raised her, the values she developed despite your focus on wealth, that shows there's good in you too. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out over Singapore's skyline. My father always said that a man's true wealth isn't in his bank account, but in his ability to acknowledge his mistakes and learn from them. Richard sat in silence, those words echoing in his mind. Everything he thought he knew about wealth, status, and worth had been turned upside down in a single day. So, Mr. Chen, Marcus turned back to face him. The question is, what lessons will you take from this experience? Richard Chen's conversation with Marcus had lasted nearly an hour, but for the guests waiting in the ballroom below, it felt like an eternity. Sarah paced nervously near the entrance, while her mother Linda tried to keep the increasingly curious guests entertained. When Richard finally returned to the ballroom, people noticed something different about him. The proud businessman who had always walked with his head held high now showed a humility that no one had seen before. His eyes were slightly red, though no one dared mention if he had been crying. He walked straight to the center of the room and picked up a microphone. The crowd fell silent, phones raised to record what everyone expected would be either a dramatic apology or another outburst. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard's voice wavered slightly. I owe everyone here an apology, but most of all, I owe one to my daughter Sarah and her fiancé Marcus. He turned to face the couple who had returned to the ballroom together. All my life, I thought I knew what wealth meant, he continued. I built my company from nothing, and I became obsessed with protecting what I had gained. Along the way, I forgot the most important lessons my own struggles had taught me. Sarah watched her father with tears in her eyes, holding tightly to Marcus's hand. Today, I learned that true wealth isn't just about money in the bank or the size of your company. Richard's voice grew stronger. My future son-in-law, whom I judged so harshly, proved to be not just wealthier than I am in terms of money, but also in character. The crowd murmured in agreement. Several of Singapore's elite businessmen nodded, some looking slightly ashamed of their own past behavior towards those they considered beneath them. Marcus chose to live simply not because he had to, but because he wanted to find genuine connections in a world where wealth often clouds everything. Richard looked at his daughter. And Sarah, my beautiful daughter, you showed me what real values look like. You chose love over luxury, character over status, even when it meant standing up to your own father. Linda Chen walked over to her husband and took his hand, proud of his transformation. So, Richard straightened his shoulders. If the couple and our guests are willing, I would like to restart this wedding ceremony. This time, not as the father who objects, but as the father who gives his complete and humble blessing. The ballroom erupted in applause. Sarah ran to her father and hugged him tightly, while Marcus watched with a gentle smile. The wedding planner quickly began reorganizing the ceremony setup, and the guests returned to their seats with renewed excitement. As they waited for the ceremony to restart, Thomas Wong approached Richard. That was quite a speech, old friend. Richard shook his head. I've known you for 30 years, Thomas. Did you know about Marcus's true identity all along? Thomas smiled. Many of us did. But Marcus asked us to keep his secret, and when you see someone like him, someone born into such privilege, choosing to prove himself through hard work and humility, you respect that choice. Meanwhile, Sarah and Marcus had a moment alone in a quiet corner of the ballroom. Are you sure you're not angry with me? Marcus asked softly. I did keep a huge secret from you. Sarah touched his cheek gently. The man I fell in love with was the one who brought me coffee when I was working late, who helped old ladies cross the street, who treated every person with kindness regardless of their status. That's who you really are. The money doesn't change that. From across the room, Richard watched his daughter with her fiancé. He saw how Marcus looked at her with pure love, how Sarah's eyes lit up when she smiled at him, and finally understood what true wealth looked like. It wasn't in the number of properties you owned or the size of your bank account. It was in the genuine connections you made and the character you showed when no one knew your true worth. As the guests retook their seats and the wedding music began to play again, Richard Chen felt, for the first time in his life, truly rich. The second attempt at the wedding ceremony was entirely different from the first. The tension that had filled the Grand Plaza Hotel's ballroom earlier had been replaced with an atmosphere of joy and genuine celebration. As Sarah walked down the aisle again, this time with both her parents escorting her, guests noticed that Richard Chen's eyes were filled with tears of happiness rather than anger. The ceremony proceeded without interruption, and when the priest pronounced Marcus and Sarah husband and wife, the applause was deafening. But it was what happened at the reception that truly showed how much things had changed in just a few hours. During the traditional father's speech, Richard surprised everyone by putting aside his prepared notes. Instead, he spoke from his heart. "When I was 12 years old," he began, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "I sold newspapers on the streets of Singapore to help my mother after my father left us. I promised myself that my children would never know that kind of struggle." He looked at Sarah and Marcus. "But today, I learned that sometimes our greatest fears can blind us to life's most important lessons. My future son-in-law chose to live that same simple life I tried so hard to escape, not because he had to, but because he wanted to prove his own worth." Marcus sat listening, holding Sarah's hand under the table, as Richard continued. "I spent months trying to protect my daughter from what I thought was a fortune hunter." Richard smiled ruefully. "Instead, I almost drove her away from a man who has shown more wisdom and character than I have in all my years of business." The wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, many of them recognizing their own prejudices in Richard's words. Later in the evening, as the celebration was in full swing, a surprise announcement was made. Marcus took the microphone with Sarah by his side. "Today has been full of revelations," he said, "but there's one more thing we'd like to share." He looked at Richard and Linda. "Sarah and I have decided to establish the Chen Zong Foundation, dedicated to supporting young entrepreneurs from humble backgrounds." Sarah stepped forward. "The foundation will provide not just funding, but mentorship and opportunities, and we'd like to ask my father to be its chairman." Richard stared at them in shock as Marcus explained further. "Who better to guide these young entrepreneurs than someone who has lived both sides of the story?" Marcus smiled. "Someone who built himself up from nothing, and who has now learned that true wealth isn't just about money." Tears flowed freely as Richard hugged both Sarah and Marcus. Linda watched proudly as her family, which had been torn apart by pride and prejudice just hours ago, came together stronger than ever. As the evening drew to a close, the hotel staff began preparing for cleanup. But before guests started leaving, Marcus had one final surprise. He gathered everyone in the hotel's grand lobby. "When I first booked this hotel for our wedding," he grinned, "I didn't mention that I owned it. But now that everyone knows, I'd like to announce that the Grand Plaza Hotel will be renamed the Chenzong Plaza." He turned to Richard. "To remind everyone that when two families come together, they don't just share a name, they share values, dreams, and a future." The story of Marcus and Sarah's wedding quickly became legendary in Singapore's business circles, but not for the reasons anyone would have expected at the start of that day. It wasn't just about the shocking revelation of Marcus's true identity or Richard's public humbling. Instead, it became a story about how true character reveals itself not in moments of wealth and power, but in times of simplicity and challenge. 1 month later, a small coffee shop in downtown Singapore got a surprise visit. Sarah and Marcus, now returned from their honeymoon, walked in hand, followed by Richard and Linda Chen. They sat at the same table where Sarah and Marcus had first met, ordering simple coffees and sharing stories. The barista who served them had no idea she was waiting on one of Asia's wealthiest families. But then again, that was exactly how they wanted it to be.